901st Contact, Part 2, Sunday, the 24th of November, 2024, 7:26 hours.
Lifelong immunity of public officials must also never be granted after they have left or resigned from office, because every public official, whose immunity has been the practice in many states for decades, must always be on an equal footing with any other person of the people and cannot and must not enjoy immunity from the law in respect of any injustice that is committed. So immunity is not allowed either in or out of office. The truth on earth, however, is that this granting of immunity was common practice in various states, and in some cases still is today in various states, but especially in unjust states. America, however, was and is particularly great and powerful in this respect, and has been since 1776, when the United States was founded, and this is still the case today. Consequently, a U.S. president of the wrong can, at his own will, prevent, declare null and void and easily cancel prosecutions against public officials or persons of the economy, religions, and also ordinary people who are guilty of criminal offenses, as I have been able to learn from my research. The current pathologically fanatical Russia hater U.S. President Biden is exploiting this in every conceivable manner, both in his private and also in his political wise, so that in his fanaticism he will do everything he can until he leaves office. You have already said several times that this man is senile, which I have checked and found to correspond to reality, but which his followers, in their blind bondage to him, are unable to recognize due to their inability to think. However, as far as what you also spoke about in the past with regard to the Reeves is concerned, what is happening today is exactly as you mentioned earlier, when the Reeves could do as they pleased, which was tantamount to a dictatorship, of which there are unfortunately still some on earth. I have also learnt that this was and still is the case on earth, because I have acquired some knowledge about it.
What needs to be said again is what I have already asked you about, and what was affirmed at the committee. What should be said openly? What should be brought up regarding those things?
Yes, I asked that as well, whereby I made an effort and explained everything, whereupon I was told that it would also be good in this regard if we also talked about it, and then you write everything down when you retrieve our conversation. I also know a lot from your early days at the center, from Simyase's explanations, because she was the first of us Plejaren here at the center, and she told me a lot. And after her came Ptah, as has already been said, who also told me a lot about that, and about what happened regarding the attempts on your life. And now that the committee has also given its consent to speak openly about this, you should bear in mind, however, that it could be even more dangerous for you if you even hint at the names you now know of some of those who.
Yes, I understand. It is probably better if I do not mention the names. Then it is probably better if we do not talk about it at all, but do not mention the tricky America that wants to usurp world domination, sparing nothing to achieve it through war crimes and illegalities.
Correct. Then there is also U.S. President Bush, who endorsed the torture methods in permanently installed torture centers, as well as those in Guantanamo in Cuba, but also those in Bagram in Afghanistan and in Abu Ghraib in Iraq, where the torture of the prisoners was cruel and appalling. Bush unscrupulously had prisoners transferred to various places and countries for torture, such as Lithuania, Romania, or Poland, as well as to Kosovo, which also allowed U.S. laws to be circumvented, but which were secretly used elsewhere in America itself in various places, and are still used today. The peace hypocrite President Barack Obama is also worth mentioning, because in Libya he launched a war that was not authorized by Congress and therefore not allowed, because, nota bene, in America Congress theoretically still has the last word. The shyster lawyers in his administration legitimized this on the grounds that it was not really a state of war. The 30,000 NATO airstrikes on Libya were therefore not a war. That is why the War Powers Resolution of Congress was not necessary. No criminal proceedings were ever opened against any of these U.S. presidents after they left office, and they were put behind bars, as you like to say. Then there is Bill Clinton, who led a NATO attack on the rest of Yugoslavia in 1999 without a UN mandate. So, from a purely political point of view, the forcible separation of Kosovo from Serbia is absolutely contrary to international law, which is also seen and understood as such by many states to this day. Apart from the fact that the whole thing corresponded to a criminal act that was never punished, as is customary in America when a president is involved in such an act, as is also the case in various other states. If we now look to the present day, if I may say so, then America under Biden is currently the greatest criminal evil on earth, because he is basically the culprit on behalf of America for the war that has been raging in Ukraine for around 3 years, which Russia's Putin started, but which could have been avoided if NATO had not insisted on being nested in Ukraine. America, with its imperialistic, unipolar ambitions, seeks to achieve the goal of completing and fulfilling the delusion of hegemony by any unlawful means, including criminal and even fraudulent lies and deceptions, with the help of the pathologically stupid who still assist by supplying weapons and money to Zelensky in Ukraine. America will probably not achieve its goal of hegemonic mania in this manner, but will only cause immeasurable disaster, just as the blind murder and destruction will also ultimately result in hundreds of thousands of deaths. America's European and aid delusional vassals, mainly the quarreling state leadership parties of Germany, are, in their low intelligence, about to take the war out into the world, because the strange nature of the current world war, which the idiots do not recognize, pardon me for using the words you keep using, which is taking place by supplying weapons and war money to Zelensky, and consequently also helping the Americans' hegemonic delusion, can very quickly degenerate into an open world war sooner or later. America is now practicing what lowly intelligent human beings, such as those lowly intelligent Nazi thinkers and their ilk in the German government, are accusing Russia of. Under the secret cover of NATO, America has shamefully broken the great measure of all agreements through lies and deceit and its delusions of hegemony against Russia. So America did it, but not Russia. Since its existence, America has shown, as I know, with around 500 very primitive military conflicts worldwide, unrivaled at the top of all aggressions in the entire history of the world. America is undeniably the absolute #1 aggressor on Earth since its existence. Not to mention what criminal things have been done to the native peoples since the immigration of Europeans to the Americas, to the near total extermination of individual tribes. Murder after murder was committed against them, and wars were even waged against them, with firearms of the invading immigrants, against bows and arrows of the natives, who of course had no chance against the modern firearms brought from Europe by the immigrants. As for Biden's actions, who is absolutely pathologically obsessed with war and its Ausartung and is fueling the war in Ukraine via the war fanatic Zelensky and is endeavoring to never let it end until America's hegemonic mania has succeeded once again, such a human being should not be president. Although U.S. President Biden is to be pitied for his obvious senility and low intelligence, his equally obvious impairment of physical control, his complete lack of integrity, and his lack of intelligentum, and therefore also his lack of intellect and reason, his war mania and his promotion of war by supplying arms, his greed for power, and his seduction to aid and abet the war by supplying arms to Zelensky are criminal and unacceptable. With his steps and actions, he is not only escalating the war conflict he himself caused, but also leading to an ever-growing and stronger reaction from Russia, as he is promoting both Russia's resistance and Zelensky's lust for war through his senile thoughts and actions, as a result of which only war continues to be the order of the day in Ukraine.
Unfortunately, that is the case, but the world population, which has become biased by faith and absolutely indifferent, does not care. Only those who have to live in such a dictatorship, such as in the EU dictatorship and currently in Syria, where Assad is still up to his mischief, but which will soon come to an end with the rebel invasion of Halep, as I said before. The Earthlings simply let everything happen to them indifferently and also allow their freedom to be taken away, and if they ever defend themselves against injustice and the taking away of freedom, then this is not done peacefully, but with murder and manslaughter as well as destruction, in the same way as when political disputes lead to war, which often has to do with revenge, coercion, or otherwise with injustice and wrongdoing. I wrote about this when I was a boy, when I was talking to Svath about these things and the behavior of human beings. Wait, I still have it written down here on the computer. Wait. Yes, here. Back then I wrote on 3rd February 1946. A life without true freedom is no life, and a human being who does not peacefully defend his freedom in every respect is running away from himself.
Yes, you spoke of that. But regarding Syria, you spoke only of the rebels who will take Halep, but not of...
Yes, that is right.
You should say everything you know if you are going to bring something up, at least when you are talking to me.
It is good, excuse me, please, but I really only want to say what I think is important at the moment, what I know and am currently talking about and am aware of, so I will not go any further. I also want to say that it is completely out of my hands to get involved in politics, and for once it is a must that I stay away from it, which is why I do not want to say too much and also never get involved in politics, which also allows me to take the freedom and the right, which I do not have enough to mention explicitly over and over again, to name and point out what is wrong with politics. But if I did not tell you everything earlier, then I simply was not thinking about what else was going to happen, because my thoughts were really only on what was going to happen in Halep. It is clear, however, when I repeat myself, that I never, ever engage in politics and will also never do so in my statements and observations, but only deal with it to the extent of saying what is ordered by politics in the world and what happens as a result. Unfortunately, not always good things, but a lot of evil, bad things, and ultimately wars. Wars of all kinds not only cause serious damage through destruction, but also destroy very valuable old, new, and expensive human achievements, as well as land that is vital and fertile for growing food, as well as many other things. This is in addition to the fact that wars etc. first and foremost bring disaster, unspeakably evil and Ausartung primitive killing or murder, and countless, above all uninvolved, human beings are maltreated and tortured. Women and girls are raped and boys and adolescents are also sexually abused, only to be shot, strangled, stabbed, or otherwise killed as a thank you. I raise my voice and my word against all of this, which is the result of politics. And this is certainly not what politicization means, but rather the opposite of what is being carried out and sanctified with politics in a malicious and Ausartung manner. But what I was talking about, I also meant the end of the dictatorship era in Syria, because the rebels' invasion of Halep is based on ending the dictatorship, which will still be this year and will be over after around 50 years. But I have forgotten when that will be, but it will certainly be this year, as I have already said. But what will come, and what will emerge from it, will unfortunately not be a good thing, because after the fall of Assad, Netanyahu will continue to rage and destroy Syria with his murderous military, as he will also annex further areas of the Golan Heights in Syria and attack Yemen, and because of the mass murderer and his actions, everything will be different from real peace. And what is also worth mentioning is that Yemen and its Houthi rebels, a Shiite political military civil war party, will not be long in exacting their revenge, as I remember from my time traveling with Svath. Of course, that was also the case. There was also America, which was still interfering militarily, and if I remember correctly, it was with the Air Force. After Assad's flight, there will also be no real unity among the people in Syria in the future. This is also because various other countries, and also those of the EU dictatorship, will interfere in Syria and somehow want to secure their nibbles. Of course, there will also be neo-Nazis from the German government who want to gain advantages in Syria with millions in aid money. And everything that will happen in the world in the future, namely all the evil that is currently being directed and brewed against the populations on Earth politically, economically, militarily, financially, and in terms of state control, is more than just state enslavement of peoples. In reality, this will effectively be a malicious and total incapacitation of all peoples or human beings on Earth by the state powers, their authorities and officials, the security organs, and with the help of their special units and the military, etc. So that will not be all in Syria. Because in addition to the overthrow of governments, uprisings, wars, revolutions, and rebellions will continue to be the order of the day in the future, just as more and more state financial terror will be exercised against the populations in all countries, which will also be undertaken and legally established by the banks and all financial institutions in general. The human beings are also becoming more and more disempowered in this respect, which is being allowed to happen indifferently, which has already begun with cash being replaced more and more by credit cards, and in many places can only be paid with these, and those who do not have one are completely out of luck. This is already the beginning of the disenfranchisement of human beings, who are allowing this to happen in their non-thinking and are still on fire for it because they believe that this will relieve them of many burdens and make them more secure with regard to their money. And when I think of what I heard in Bern, when I was able to overhear two pastors, unintentionally and by chance, as they say, who were in agreement about this, as one literally said to the other, "It is good that people believe. Faith brings us a lot of money." But the fact that they, the people, allow themselves to be incapacitated by this, as by the state, the banks and the entire economy, etc., and ultimately to the point of total incapacitation, is so far removed from their ability to foresee the whole of what is to come in the future, because the human being is rapidly becoming more and more atrophied, increasingly indifferent and disinterested, while his general knowledge already leaves much to be desired, and he is effectively lost within himself. Indeed, he is falling further and further behind in his development as a human being, and this impairment is becoming more and more noticeable, especially in that human beings are becoming increasingly indifferent to one another. Family relationships deteriorate, quarrels, fights, murder, and manslaughter increase uncontrollably and devastatingly, as do drug addiction, crime, and Ausartung of all kinds. The earthling is so blindly addicted to sectarian and religious beliefs as well as to worldly beliefs of all kinds in every respect that they are so ingrained in him that he is no longer able to realize and recognize the effective reality and its truth, let alone that he can foresee and think about the future in logic, because every kind of belief prevents and prohibits any form of independent thinking. But here it is obviously different, namely that people think for themselves and do not simply believe everything. Wait a minute. Yes, here it is. What is blabbered about, as Mrs. Well, of course that is not true, because even with Svath or your grandfather I had the opportunity to see animals, creatures and other creatures as well as plants of many different genera and species that have certainly not yet been discovered, even here in Europe, for example, worldwide, especially in the jungles or primeval forests. There are still animals, creatures, and other creatures that I have seen together with Svath, and which, as far as I know, have not yet been discovered, which I would say is fortunate. We also saw really large and small life forms in the oceans, which I have not yet learnt have been discovered. This is also the case with plants of many genera and species, which were effectively thousands of different species, and to my knowledge have not yet been discovered. Otherwise, they would certainly have been publicized. There really were a great many genera and species of plants. Even some trees were among them, 3 or 4 if I remember correctly. At least 2 genera have since been discovered, of which seedlings were produced after their discovery, and have since been sold commercially worldwide. I got hold of 2 species and planted them here in the center grounds, where they are now growing magnificently. But back to what I said about the war in the Middle East. With the end of the dictatorship era in Syria, the Americans will of course get more involved again. They have their military in the country anyway and will keep it there because In my opinion, anything else would not fit in with the hegemony mania. In general, nothing peaceful and also nothing perfect in this respect will really come out of this, and so the next evil is absolutely certain to grow out of one that has been eliminated. Russia is also stationed in Syria and has been involved for years, as has Turkey, but that is not so important, because it only really cares about the Kurds, who were actually already separated by the British and French, partly to Turkey, Persia, and Iraq. Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, who was the actual founder of the Republic of Turkey in 1923, promised the Kurds autonomy after the World War from 1914 to 1918, but this was only to win them over to his political side. Immediately after his promise, however, he showed what he actually wanted, namely to integrate the Kurds unconditionally into the Turkish nation, which he wanted to achieve by assimilating the Kurds by force, but which the Kurds are still resisting today. Now, however, it must be said that in the future the war stink in the Middle East will flare up again and again, which already arose in 1948 when the State of Israel was proclaimed by David Ben-Gurion, whose war mania, together with the war mania of the neighboring Arab states, is also world famous. Consequently, there is no peace, and there will never really be peace. And the fact that Israel, or Netanyahu's murderous military, will continue to bomb and spread and annex land after the fall of the dictatorship in Syria is something I saw with Bermuda when we observed events together in the future, and also saw many other very unpleasant things, especially in the Palestinian territory and in Lebanon, as well as in Syria. Anti-Israeli forces have always been strongly interested and involved in getting Israel out of the world again, so peaceful coexistence is not possible and will also never be possible. There is a reason why Jordan is still being spared, at least for a time, but it has already been spared in the past and is now calm, although it does not offer absolute security in the long term. Consequently, the two-state solution proposed by lowly intelligent and simple-minded, and therefore non-thinking idiots and others incapable of thinking, is not only extremely stupid and ill-considered, but absolutely illusory and a pathological delusion. The stink in the Middle East began several thousand years ago, when the Hebrews emerged and tried to spread, but were then kidnapped and ruled by the Egyptians, but fled and finally landed where Judah then emerged, but which was then one day occupied by the Babylonians with war, because the king of Judah, so it is said, did not pay taxes to the Babylonians. Thus the ancestors of the Semitic people came under the rule of Babylonia, which was ruled by Nebuchadnezzar II, but one day returned to the land of Judea, which was conquered after many years of wandering following the flight from Egypt. As a result, the distant descendants of the former and original people, who first emerged and lived in the far north of Mesopotamia, came to a homeland. But what can you do? Namely, nothing and nothing at all, when there are elements in government, including their advisors, who are up to their idiotic mischief and who understand nothing at all about the toots and blows of real and correct governance and thinking ahead for the near and distant future and therefore do not belong in government. Well, in the whole of the wild and religiously conditioned politics in the Middle East, the stinking religious Persia or Iran is also involved, which specifically supports the Israel haters, namely Hamas, which belongs to the Palestinians, as well as Hezbollah, which operates underground in Lebanon, and which together have led to the fact that since the creation of Israel, everything has repeatedly led to war, death, murder, misery, and hardship, and will continue to do so. In addition to the initial war to create the State of Israel in 1947, there was the so-called War of Independence, which then turned into an open war in 1948, when there was an Israeli-Arab civil war, which also brought the State of Israel into being. Since then, there have been various skirmishes with Arab states, which have been constantly dragged into them by Israel. The War of Independence was therefore only the beginning of the eternal skirmishes, because other wars followed, such as the Six-Day War. Then there was also the Sinai War, which came about because the Israeli military attacked Egypt together with the French and British military in order to occupy the Sinai Peninsula. But there was also the Yom Kippur War, or as it was called, as Israel also murdered in the Lebanon War, sometime in the 1980s, and was involved in the civil war raging there. Also in the new millennium, in the first years of 2000, it was probably 2005 or 2006, Israel again carried out murder in Lebanon. This time, if I remember correctly, it was because Hezbollah had kidnapped Israeli military personnel. But that was not the end of it, because a few years later the theater of war continued because, it was probably Hamas, etc., Israel was shot at again and again with rockets. This was repeated only 2 or 3 years later, and then 2 or 3 years later again. Then again after the same period of time. And finally in 2023, Israel started the current war under the leadership of the mass murderer Netanyahu, because the terror and rocket fire from Hamas continued unabated and therefore never stopped. After Ptah's thorough investigations, he told me that Netanyahu, in addition to being strictly religious, was also a fraudster and on the take, and therefore guilty of corruption. In my view, this is treason, as, this is what comes to mind at the moment, was also committed by the Israeli spy Kam or Kamet or whatever his name was, which I have forgotten, who gained the friendship and trust of many human beings in Syria and then betrayed them. Bernadette's note. The spy's name was Elijah Eli Ben Shaul Cohen, born 28 December 1924 in Alexandria, Egypt, executed in Damascus on 18 May 1965. He is considered a national hero in Israel. In my opinion, this is also treason without conscience, as well as treason against his country, since he received the political military facts in confidence, which he then betrayed to Israel. As I see it, this no longer corresponds to espionage, but to a common betrayal of trust and treason. The man who, as a former Egyptian in Syria, wormed his way into the confidence of people in the government to such an extent that he gained access to even the most confidential information, and then passed it on to Israel. That was probably more than just nasty espionage, but effective treason, because he was practically treated in confidence like a local. But before he was able to penetrate any further and commit treason because, like every human being, he was not immune to making mistakes. He was exposed and publicly executed by hanging in 1965, which Asket and I were able to observe together from her beamship, because I was traveling with her many times around the world until 1975.
That is familiar to me, because Asket told me a lot about what you experienced together, how you were often also time-shifted in many places. I remember that she mentioned dwarves that you visited, and that...
Correct. That was even several times and in different places around the world.
I'm also aware of that, but I am interested in the dwarven people she was talking about who live or have lived somewhere in the Far East. She called them Ephagog, because that is what they are said to have called themselves. I am interested in these dwarves, which is why I want to look them up.
Whether they still exist today, I do not know. Back then, when Asket and I were with them, they lived quite primitively, were about 1 meter tall and stole children from other groups of people, who they fattened or slaughtered or killed for food, as the case may be. At least that was the case when we were there for the first time. Later then, it was after our time, about 130 years later, things had changed in this respect. But what happened then, I do not know, as I also do not know whether these little human beings still exist, and if so, whether they have been discovered in the meantime.
Where was that? If you tell me, then I want to investigate there.
I am afraid I am going to have to disappoint you there, because all I know is that it was somewhere in what is now called Indonesia.
Then I will endeavor to research this. Maybe Asket can explain more about it to me if I ask her.
Possibly, but whether she can give exact details, I do not know.
That will become clear when I ask her. But now I want to go on explaining what I have found out. Through my research up to the time of the founding of America, I realized that since then, and therefore since time immemorial, the presidents of America have committed unhindered and almost regularly, by evil orders, monstrous and criminal offenses, including orders for wars, insidious murderous acts, insurrections, and revolutions in many foreign states. It is also clear to say that during the entire time since the existence of America, and thus since time immemorial in this country, and thus in all U.S. states, a form of unrest movement has prevailed as a whole, which takes many forms, and which is strictly based on very diverse religious mania, sometimes even combined with the death penalty, which is exercised through executions. As I have realized through my research, there is no other state on earth where so many fanatical and different religions and religious and satanic sects prevail, some of which are not only criminal, but are even used criminally through assassinations to gain wealth. In this regard, a special mention should be made of an alleged church, which in any case claims that very expensive, also allegedly psychoeducational and personality promoting, as well as hypothetical knowledge promoting courses and training, etc., would make human beings into effective great men, whereby, however, acts of assassination are included in certain circumstances. Various deviant religions, which as such enjoy the protection of state approval and emerge as religious communities of faith, are not only often based on fanatical and extremely peculiar justifications, which are often only presented as reasons of faith, but which in truth are exceptionally based on greed for wealth, whereby individual religious leaders or sect leaders enrich themselves through the low intelligence of their believers. And when reasons for hatred, dangerous insights or deviations suddenly arise among the believers of various sects, as I have recognized in my investigations, it often results in assassinations being carried out, such as the whereby this is handled in such a way, but nevertheless enjoys state protection because the truth is not being investigated, as you say in each case.
First of all, the following. Before you go on talking about your investigations, because you spoke of assassination. That this happens I know that, because some sufferers from America, 2 persons were, one of whom then committed suicide, and also 1 person from Germany, as well as 1 person from Switzerland, have contacted me about and asked for advice. But I promised them to keep quiet about it. But the term now, assassination, should be explained, because quite a lot of Earthlings really do not understand what the term assassination actually and effectively means, as I have often experienced myself when I have talked to people about it and then had to explain it. The term assassination is actually to be understood simply as meaning that a human being, if he is assassinated, is murdered deliberately and insidiously, cowardly and from behind, that is to say, sneakily, and, as it is called, assassinally, that is to say, from behind, so that the murdered person does not even see who is snuffing out his life. However, the term assassination is also used in a completely different wise. For example, it is used with the word mouchel, whereby this expression is still used, at least by those human beings who still know the term, and that is when talking about a mute human being. Elsewhere, however, mouchel, moucheln, or mouchelnder is also used to refer to a human being who is grumpy and sullen, bad-tempered, angry, unpleasant, annoying, morose, grouchy and disagreeable, etc.
I did not know that, and so your instruction is valuable to me. Thank you. When you speak, you sometimes use words that are foreign to me and that I have neither learnt nor know the meaning of.
There is no need to thank you for that after all. It is just an explanation. However, you are no exception when it comes to not understanding words, because many Earthlings also no longer understand how to interpret some words. This is because the terms have simply disappeared from our vocabulary, but I still use them here and there because they are still familiar to me, and I learnt them at school or from Svath.
That will probably be so correct for you, but for me it is really valuable that you explain the meaning to me, because by doing so I expand the scope of my knowledge regarding the use of words. But what has been said has interrupted my speech, through which I wanted to interpret that wars and massacres in foreign states have been initiated several times by various U.S. presidents, as even in America itself the so-called War of Secession was ordered by U.S. President Lincoln. This period.
Yes, I know this was the Civil War in the 1860s, which claimed nearly 740,000 lives, as I remember from your grandfather. However, it is claimed that there were fewer deaths than there really were. But this is typical of America, whose figures in such matters never correspond to the truth, as is usually the case with all events around the world. As a rule, False statements are always made when it comes to numbers, because there is always fibbing through estimates, as is also the case when it comes to describing an event. The rule also applies here with Earthlings that if something can be remembered, a lot is made up and invented, although it must be said that this often happens because a certain fantasy automatically fakes a memory in human beings, so to speak. This makes them see and recognize things and events that correspond to pure worthless illusions, that is to say, absolutely false realities, contrary to actual sensory perceptions. These are actually hallucinations, that is to say, absolutely only supposed perceptions of truths that really only correspond to imaginary illusions or false perceptions. This is in contrast to when events are deliberately embellished with false embellishments and interesting memories, or when these arise from wishful thinking and correspond to positive self-deceptions, when something is faked with regard to a less positive reality. But what else needs to be said about what I mentioned earlier regarding slavery? This war was about the abolition of slavery, which was still practiced in the southern states of America, but which was a thorn in the side of the North Americans. A large number of Swiss were also among the slaveholders who later built up large corporations in Switzerland, such as Ulrich Zellweger and Alfred Escher, if I may name the best-known Swiss slaveholders.
Correct, I also fathomed that. But it was a civil war that was started on the orders of the U.S. President and his advisors. However, in the course of time, from the 1940s onwards, American presidential orders also led to underhand and perfidious Secret Service activities, worldwide, as well as military machinations, which have remained secret to this day. Popular uprisings, revolutions and overthrows of state leadership in foreign countries were also provoked, but also carried out in a cooperative manner. But America interfered unjustifiably and deceitfully, as well as openly, politically, and militarily in the affairs of foreign states, and still does so today, as I explained, which is tacitly and globally tolerated and accepted by state leaders and peoples. This is often because, as I found out, there is a great fear of American retaliation among those who are dependent on America on the one hand, but on the other hand among other states and peoples out of genuine or false friendliness towards America. And indeed, the deep fear among America-dependent people is extremely justified, because it is a fear of a certain vindictiveness, and therefore fear of retaliation by the powerful of America is justified. So there is a fear that has also always prevailed among U.S. presidential advisors and supporters, as well as among those parts of the people who go along with America's leaders.
That is indeed the case, although there are also other female and male Americans who think and act differently. I am thinking of those who sent aid packages all over the world in the 1960s out of a genuine need for help, with donated by the people of the United States, printed on them in dark blue. At that time I was in India, working at Gurgaon Road at Ashoka Ashram in Marauli on Dog Hill, where Miss Rogers and Mrs. Fisk were in charge. Working under the patronage of the SPCA Note, Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. SPCA is a common name for non-profit animal welfare organizations around the world. The oldest SPCA organization is the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, which was founded in England in 1824 and was overseen by the President of India, Dr. Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan. He was also a very well-known philosopher, and it was a great pleasure to be able to talk, philosophize, and discuss this and that with him. If I remember correctly, the governor of Johannesburg was in charge of the animal welfare organization SPCA, or the Society for the Protection of Cruelty to Animals, on behalf of Holland. There I experienced how miserable convulsions and scams with relief supplies for the poor are turned. Because their relief gifts, the American Emergency Relief Packages, which American helpers had donated, were only distributed and passed on to Christians and not to the poor. Only Christian churches, Christian groups, and Christian organizations were considered and received packages, but not people of other faiths, which was certainly not the intention of the donors. What is more, and I found this to be the worst part, I was obliged to cycle a good 20 kilometers to Delhi every week on a bicycle and trailer, to collect 10 American aid packages from a Christian organization, which contained bread flour that was then cooked into porridge on Dog Hill and fed to the dogs. In contrast, I also experienced in Pakistan, in Karachi, that huge bales of compressed clothes, which had come from Europe and were intended for people in need and had of course been donated by people willing to help, were being sold on the market at expensive prices. This, as well as several other similar experiences regarding aid packages and money donations from Europe for people in need in the Middle East, and also in Africa, made me decide that I have never donated anything to so-called aid organizations since then, and refuse to do anything in a charitable manner ever again. I have been totally reluctant to donate money since I have known that a full 40% of every donation goes into the pockets of the aid organizations, instead of actually reaching those in need. On the whole, I am of the opinion that if help is given, it should be given free of charge, and not in such a way that a profit is made from it. If help is given, then it should be done selflessly and not for financial gain.
I am of the same opinion in this regard, because any help only corresponds to such help if it is given selflessly, and those who are engaged in giving help do not demand profit in any wise.
Exactly, because aid is turned into a business, because the aid organizations are actually, if you look closely, commercial, and pursue business interests that are concerned with making a profit. So if, as permitted by law, 40% is collected to cover expenses, such as for the remuneration of those working for the aid and for the dispatch of the many relief supplies, then this is no longer done selflessly, but effectively commercially, which no longer corresponds to an aid organization, and which can also no longer be called such, but which also defrauds the donors through the commercial process. So if only selfless and no percentage of donations and relief supplies and relief funds are diverted to aid organizations, etc., because everything is done through one's own finances and labor, then the right to be called an aid organization is also given. However, if this is not the case, then the whole thing is to be labeled as commercial aid, or something similar, whereby the donors know that only a part, namely little more than half of their donations are actually given to help those in need. In any case, it is very important that all aid of any kind and in any country is checked to ensure that all aid is actually given to those in need, so that it is not used for expensive resale on markets. But I interrupt you again with incidents that are from the course of my life and have just happened here and there.
But they are interesting and show what you have seen, experienced, and witnessed. But now I want to say a little more about the knowledge I have accumulated through my investigations and the insights I have gained into the intrigues that have arisen as a result of these extremely cunning and deceitful, treacherous and scheming machinations by America or, as a rule, by its presidential leaders, because U.S. presidents have always been responsible and liable for them, together with like-minded advisors and supporters. This has occurred in this wise over the course of only about 250 years since the founding of America, costing hundreds of millions of human lives. So countless millions of human beings have died, murdered, and countless women have been raped, and tens of thousands of human beings have been crippled. The indigenous people who lived in America before the Europeans stole the land were falsely called Indians because they were supposedly called that by Christopher Columbus when he discovered America, thinking he had landed in India. Later, the land was called America and was effectively plundered en masse by countless immigrants, especially by Europeans who invaded, also including criminals and often religious people, especially religious groups who were undesirable in Europe and even endangered their lives. In many cases, the land was colonized by bloody and murderous massacres directed against the indigenous people of the time, who, equipped with bows and arrows, had no chance against the firearms of the Europeans and were therefore at such a disadvantage. Consequently, they had to leave their land to the murdering and robbing immigrants, who quickly fell into disputes with each other and waged bloody wars against each other, as a result of which the colonial powers of Great Britain and France, for example, fought bloody battles for supremacy in North America.
Besides the fact that they murdered countless indigenous people and waged war against them. It is absolutely incomprehensible that the world's population does not defend itself against America's hegemonic spread throughout the world, and that practically all peoples of all states simply put up with all this without resistance and indifference and accept it, so that every state on earth and its peoples have to constantly reckon with the threat of America interfering in their affairs or even gradually annexing the states.
That also surprises me. But when I consider the indifference of Earth humans, and the fact that the majority of humanity is concerned with itself and does not care about the welfare of its neighbor, then action from this perspective is consequently absolutely inevitable.
Yes, it is, but not excusable.
Of course not. But let us leave that. Now, as far as the naming of America is concerned, I have explored through many records and traveling back to earlier times that the name America does not come from Columbus, but can originally be traced back to a man named Amerigo Vespucci, who made voyages of discovery as a navigator from about the years 1499 to 1502, and then named the country Amerigo, from which America is said to have originated. It should also be said that Columbus was not the first to visit America, but that the Norsemen had already been there around 900 years earlier, where they briefly settled a small area, especially in the north of the country and also in Canada, as it is known today. The Norsemen maintained good relations with various indigenous peoples, with some intermingling even taking place, but there were also acts of war with Native Americans. Since the last century, the Americas have traded heavily in cocaine for weapons, particularly in Central America, but with criminals and criminals worldwide. But weapons and their production and trade should be banned, because they are used for murder and wars and the like, mainly military, and even in my grandfather's time, as I know from his annals, you called every military association a murderer's organization. All of us who know you think that this designation is absolutely correct, because what Earth humans call military defense does not correspond to it in any wise, because what is done and carried out in the process cannot be described as anything other than mass murder in continuous succession, which is accompanied by the rape of women and girls, and even of boys and adolescents, and by immense and senseless destruction, as I myself have seen in the acts of war in the Middle East and Ukraine. And this is happening on both sides of the warring parties, as is also being done by the military of Israel, the Palestinians and the Lebanese, as well as the Ukrainians and the Russians, along with their mercenaries and the other secretly involved military of various nations.
Is that really supposed to be said openly?
Yes, it should be, because the people should know what reality is.
Whatever you say.
Yes. Then I want to continue talking about what I have been able to fathom even more recently. There was Ronald Wilson Reagan, a U.S. actor and Republican politician who was the 33rd governor of California from 1967 to 1975, as then the 40th president of the United States from 1981 to 1980, la year 2. Ronald Reagan launched a covert war against the state of Nicaragua. Dirty and mean, because as a hater of communism, he believed that the Nicaraguan Sandinista government was secretly working to introduce and spread communism throughout Latin America. He was therefore fanatical about overthrowing the Sandinista government, to which end he vehemently tried to have a mercenary force called the Contras financially supported by the U.S. Congress so that this counter-revolutionary force would fulfill his delusional idea. However, this funding was rejected by the U.S. Congress, so from then on Reagan secretly financed the war through illegal drug trafficking, namely by illegally sourcing drugs from Latin America and selling them illegally, and arranging illegal arms deals with Iran with the proceeds from the illegal drug trade, whereby these weapons were then, again illegally of course, flown directly from Iran to Central America in transport planes secretly chartered by him. This was arranged by a pilot who had a large fleet of transport planes at the airfield in Mena, Arkansas, through which all the weapons for peace were transported, illegally of course. The return flight then took a diversion via Colombia, where drugs, mainly cocaine and crack cocaine, were loaded, which had a black market value of around $7 billion roundabout. The U.S. Secret Service, the CIA, also worked in the background to a large extent, although of course everything had to remain secret, so this fact was not publicized at first, nor was Ronald Reagan's private war. But as it had to happen, the whole thing was uncovered after all, and then everything was done in Washington to protect President Ronald Reagan with the lies that he had known nothing about everything and that someone else had been identified as the culprit who had organized everything. Namely, note, the name should not be mentioned. The drug lord in Colombia, who had supplied the drugs, called Barry Seal, was shot dead on the street in Louisiana in 1986 before he could testify against Ronald Reagan, the CIA, and before a grand jury and a jury. But that was not important, because either way Ronald Reagan clearly remained unchallenged, and of course also after his term of office and presidency, because immunity in America also applies after the term of office. But it was also President Ronald Reagan who used the CIA Secret Service to launch intrigues against Jacobo Arbenz, who was democratically elected president in Guatemala. The whole thing ended with him being overthrown. The background to all of Reagan's actions was not because Reagan knew that Jacobo Arbenz had communist interests, but because it was about his interests in big money, which centered around the United Fruit Group. No means was criminal, bad, or mean enough to achieve his greedy goal. The fact that he also had his dirty and murderous hands in El Salvador, where he supported the military regime by ordering U.S. Special Forces to liquidate and murder opposition members with death squads, such as professors of the Universidad Católica, even an archbishop at the altar, as well as nuns and priests, etc., was not made public.
Like many other things, also not. Major and most serious breaches of the law of all kinds, as well as vile acts contrary to international law by presidents and their appointees and secret services, etc., also remain completely secret and unpunished in the USA, as in many other countries on Earth. As a result, the wrongdoers, that is to say the presidents and those associated with them, such as the advisors and so on, are never held accountable.
As a matter of fact, that is the case, especially when we talk specifically about America's presidents and those who work with them. They can commit all kinds of law-breaking with impunity, as can the presidents and those who assist them in many other countries, just as they can also regularly lie and deceive the people with impunity. Just as they can also carry out military wars of aggression and strictly secret peace-disturbing interventions and deny involvement in them. But we are talking about America in particular, in this way also about all U.S. states, whereby a great deal is vehemently denied by this multi-state government.
Sure, and the American people, as it is exactly the same with other peoples, are kept in the dark about everything that is crooked, unlawful, mean, dangerous, as well as hostile, tinkered against other states in the government and by the president and his fellow travelers with him. But the American presidency in particular, and its co-joiners in this round dance, have always surpassed anything imaginable, and is common practice to a much lesser extent in other countries on Earth. Here in Switzerland, unfortunately, there are also such elements at work who have been left unscathed by the people, and whom I describe as traitors to the country. And it is nothing else when a figure in the Federal Council adopts and applies sanctions against Russia from the EU dictatorship. It is the same as getting involved in the war in Ukraine by clearing minefields there with Swiss or Swiss funding, or then bringing Ukraine forward and putting Switzerland at a nasty disadvantage by purchasing material for the murderous military organization, or making efforts to join the EU dictatorship and even the murderous organization NATO. The truth is that all this is nothing other than treason and betrayal of our Swiss neutrality, which has saved our country and the Swiss population from war and disaster in the last 2 world wars. The comical Europeanization that idiots have been striving for a long time, that is to say, the delusion of joining NATO and the EU dictatorship, is effectively so brain-wreckingly stupid and completely irresponsible that every male and female rational person's hat must go up. But the fact that this is not happening in the federal parliament, the Council of States and the National Council truly speaks volumes for itself.
When I think of my grandfather Svath's annals, which also found their way into the committee's conversation, from which it emerged that a group was sent to fathom the future of the earth and its humanity, then not only unpleasant, but even very malicious and evil findings emerged. This is especially true for Switzerland, as a great deal was fathomed because you work here. For example, the research has shown that joining NATO and the EU would have the worst consequences for the whole country and the Swiss population. So those responsible for Switzerland's governance should never join NATO and also not the European Union, because...
But I will keep that quiet and just dot the I's. Do not talk about it anymore, but go on about the insights you have gained.
As you wish. The following evidence, which to my knowledge has remained secret and has never been made public in such a way that the American people learnt the truth, but were kept in complete ignorance of all the criminal things that were criminally arranged from the White House. For example, what was fabricated in Laos, namely that a completely secret bombing war was waged there, which the presidents of America, namely Nixon and Johnson, had ordered. According to Bermunda's investigations, a total of 237,416 human beings were killed or forced to flee the country and leave their homes as a result of the bombing in an area that was considered free and should not be burdened by acts of war. Another example is based on the fact that from 1953, when the 34th U.S. President, Dwight Davis Ike Eisenhower, was in office. He was also a general in the Hitler-Nazi World War 1939 to 1945 as Supreme Commander of the Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force in Europe. He also belonged to the Republican Party as a politician, and as mentioned, was U.S. President from 1953 to 1961. He personally and angrily shot 2 Germans who did not or could not answer his questions, so he murdered them. But those present at the event remained silent for the rest of their lives. So Eisenhower's crime, the double murder, was never reported to the courts, and he was never prosecuted or punished for it, and the murder was also never made public. No criminal proceedings were opened against any of these criminals and unlawful presidents in office, or after they left office. Instead, as a result of their immunity, everything was concealed from the public and remained unpunished. On the other hand, there was also President John Fitzgerald Kennedy, who insidiously ordered a CIA intelligence-led attack on Cuba, also secretly refraining from any help and not interfering with any infiltrated forces, allegedly, when the Bay of Pigs invasion took place and failed. The Bay of Pigs invasion became known because it was a military attack on Cuba organized by America and carried out by around 1,300 Cuban exiles. They had fled to America all those years before, some of them during the time of the former dictator Fulgencio Batista, and attacked Cuba at the Bay of Pigs on 17 April 1961 with secret CIA assistance. Volunteers from Guatemala were also involved, although the whole thing was absolutely aimed at putting an end to Fidel Castro's revolutionary government and overthrowing him. The invasion was the first highlight of the U.S. actions directed against the Castro regime, which originated from the American presidency, although this was vehemently denied. Although a few days after the event, President Kennedy had to admit publicly that he was responsible for everything. The invasion, which failed ignominiously, was fundamentally a bad piece of work that was not only a military disaster for the United States of America, but above all a failed political disaster, which was sharply criticized in America itself and abroad. In addition, Kennedy and thus America lost a great deal of trust around the world, which naturally strengthened Castro, who had been openly advocating his communist orientation of the Cuban Revolution since 1959, etc. The following is also worth mentioning. As I was able to find out, U.S. President Bill Clinton led a NATO attack on the rest of Yugoslavia in 1999, and without a UN mandate. So, from a purely political point of view, the forcible separation of Kosovo from Serbia is absolutely contrary to international law, which is also seen and understood as such by many states to this day, as I have to explain. Apart from the fact that the whole thing corresponded to a criminal act that was never punished, as is usual. In America, when a U.S. president is involved in such an act and is also protected by immunity, as is also the case in various other states. In America, executions and other murders have been carried out by the military and the secret services since time immemorial, sometimes with the full knowledge of the U.S. president, without any trial or atonement for the murderers. This murderousness began with George Washington, for he had already started with murder before he became President of America, and so he murdered an officer. It was a Frenchman who held up a white cloth and who approached him with some other military officers and wanted to ask him for a truce or peace. But before the soldier holding up the white cloth could even say a word, Washington shot him in cold blood without further ado, shouting that all those accompanying the murdered man would be killed in the same way if they were carrying a concealed weapon. However, all of them were unarmed, also the officer shot by Washington. Washington was there at the time with a small military force and was spying on French military personnel. This was during World War I, or just 1 or 2 years earlier, which the Americans only refer to as the 7-Year War. Washington was a war fanatic who was fanatical about hearing bullets whistling through the air, like Zelensky in Ukraine and the real author of the war in Ukraine, namely U.S. President Biden, who is also a crazy war fanatic. Systematic executions and other murders have been carried out since time immemorial and are still being carried out today against human beings who are judged and suspected of being unjust or right-wing threats or dangerous terrorists. The elimination of alleged threats or suspects using new technology is carried out preemptively by drones, without the need for a court of law. Since this murder technique has been in use, probably by secret services, no American president has been held accountable and punished for the use of this murder practice, because immunity protects them from it. These murder crimes are kept secret from the people, as are many other things, although these are unparalleled crimes that should be made public and are even punishable around the world. The USA, however, silently ignores this, and the fact that the American president is also making himself liable to prosecution by ordering or also only tolerating such eliminations is completely disregarded, and he is also protected by his immunity. But U.S. presidents who commit such crimes are not held accountable either in America or anywhere outside America in other countries.
Bermuda and you listed, as you said days ago, some 614 such secret and criminal drone attacks, etc., committed by the U.S., usually by its intelligence agencies and military, abroad. As you were able to fathom, and how these criminal acts were then sometimes mendaciously publicized as acts of war. America spared no expense in its actions to assassinate suspects, and did not shy away from destroying entire housing complexes with airstrikes, which of course also resulted in the deaths of many human beings who had absolutely nothing to do with the suspects. The number of these collateral deaths, as they are called, is unknown, as there are no records of them. The whole criminal procedure of murder in this regard is even authorized by law and is based on Article 51 of the UN Charter. The criminal justification and authorization for this was given by the US Parliament and the UN Security Council in order to be able to wage a war on terror after the events of the terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center Tower in New York on 11 September 2001.
The Iraq wars were started and carried out by the USA without justification, just as wars are always unjustified and vendettas of powerful people and state leaders, and absolutely unjustified with lies and deceit, thereby killing many hundreds of thousands of civilians. For which the authors of the first and second wars were first President Bush Sr., then his son President Bush Jr., but for which they were never held to account in court. The UN or its Secretary General, Kofi Annan, merely labeled these incredible mass murders as illegal and as a trifle, so to speak, whereby the author of the first war, the 41st U.S. President, George H.W. Bush, and also the author of the second war, his son and 43rd U.S. President, George W. Bush, were neither reprimanded, nor brought to justice, nor punished and put behind bars for life. Neither of them was charged after their war, neither in America, nor in any other state in the world, nor by an internationally competent court, which America would never recognize anyway, because it obviously simply tolerates war crimes.
The war in the Middle East now, fanatically pushed forward, especially by the mass murderer Netanyahu at the head of directing his Israel-murdering military, as well as with America's help, although this is vehemently denied, will then also continue in Syria when the dictatorship regime in Syria comes to an end in the near future. Netanyahu, because he hates Arabia with a pathological fanaticism, will continue his mass murder and hate destruction in Syria, and will therefore not let go of it. This will also bring new evil and further discord in the future, just as the same is also true of the fanatical Hamas killers and Hezbollah killers, which means that overall there is really nothing good, but rather misery, cruelty and vengefulness as well as mass murder. Destruction and devastation, depravity, death, aggression, vileness and meanness will continue to be programmed for the future, and will be the order of the day, and will truly bring nothing good. Just like the war in Ukraine, which will ultimately bring nothing good. For which the warmonger Zelensky, under the guidance of the Americans, and mainly under that of the senile and morbidly fanatical Russophobic Biden's war mania, is primarily to blame. But this blame also lies with all those countries, incited by America and Germany, that supply weapons, ammunition and war money to Zelensky and thus to America. But mainly with that part of those in power in Germany that consists of neo-Nazis and is working behind the scenes and idiotically to ensure that the war can ultimately come to Europe after all. The neo-Nazi idiots do not realize that Biden is waging and dragging out the war against Russia from America, whereby that part of those in power in Germany, which is clothed in the neo-Nazi mindset and so stupid, does not realize that Germany is becoming even more dependent on America than it already is as a result of the neo-Nazi actions, in order to be able to fulfill the U.S. hegemony delusion a little further. According to official figures, after 80 years since the end of World War II, there are still around 35 to 40,000 U.S. troops stationed in Germany, with a further 20,000 U.S. civilian employees of the U.S. Armed Forces working in Germany, plus a little over 30,000 family members from the USA, which, according to America's hegemonic delusion, should remain that way. Ramstein is America's air base, which is located in the German state of Rhineland-Palatinate and is part of the Kaiserslautern military community, which effectively corresponds to the largest American community outside the United States of America. It is not yet time for Germany or that part of the neo-Nazi government to act in such a stupid, idiotic and criminal manner that Germany supplies the long-range German Taurus missiles to Zelensky in Ukraine. The very cruise missiles that could be fired very far into Russia, which would then lead to the final catastrophe and force Russia to put up a vicious defense. Such an event is still being prevented by the common sense of Chancellor Scholz, who, while allowing himself to be negatively influenced all round, is still largely keeping his distance from a Taurus delivery to Zelensky. This is to be carefully considered by those in the German government who are effectively covert neo-Nazis and who demand and advocate the delivery of these missiles because they lack any intelligence and any iota of responsibility. They are also the ones who cheer in particular about the war fanaticism of the senile and war-mad U.S. President Biden, who suffers in a lowly intelligent and simple-minded way from the U.S. hegemony delusion, and is also a rattling U.S. president. Not to be forgotten is also Russia, from which the effective peace for the earthly world is supposed to emerge in the distant future, but where Putin reigns deadly and destructive, just as wrong, obsessed and murderous and destructive that only misery, suffering, and hardship emerge from it. All of this will result in very unpleasant things for the future, with America fundamentally leading the way as the most miserable role model of all, and being emulated by the neo-Nazis in the German government, thus openly or deceitfully working against those rulers and parties who want neither strife nor war, but true peace and non-interference in the affairs of other states, including the war in Ukraine. All this has been the case since time immemorial, as has also been the case with America's hegemonic mania and its nasty machinations, as well as the injustice of all those countries and their governments and populations that supply weapons to Zelensky and create mischief as they have always done, as the history of Earth humans has proven since time immemorial. This, as well as Trump's recent endeavors as the new U.S. president, who, as a black lump in the egg, will be more than just strange and world-stirring. But to say more about this is not my place, as it is also not my place to say that Trump—
That you keep quiet about what you have said now, that will be there.
Yeah, I just told you that. Consequently, I'm just going to make my points when recalling the conversation. Besides, so even if I were to talk, nothing could be changed, because what has already happened in the future cannot be avoided or changed to not happen. So we do not need to talk about that, because what Svath and I have seen happen in the future also cannot be changed, just as anything that has happened in the past cannot be changed. Well, it is good that you are informing me about all the things you have fathomed. But as I have told you before, and you are of the same opinion as I am, it is that things are even worse for the freedom of human beings today than they were in the bailiff's time. So far, you are the only human being, and not even an earthling, who agrees with my findings and thoughts. Back then, I mean explicitly in the times of the bailiffs, there were actually few laws, ordinances and regulations that controlled human beings down to their private lives. Whereas today there are thousands of them, idiotically perpetuated in state decrees and fabricated by powerful people who have come to the helm of government. The elements at the helm of government believe themselves to be big, strong, clever, wise and competent, but are as dumb as a box of rocks, and as a rule come together in parties and in their lowly intelligence and simple-mindedness dream up new laws, ordinances and regulations, etc., which do more and more harm instead of good and increasingly stifle the freedom and real independence of human beings and turn them more and more into state slaves through state control. Especially since the end of the World War in 1945, a great many would-be rulers and unfortunately a great many stupid people who are uneducated in terms of humanity, selfish and delusional rulers and greedy for power have come to the helm of governments all over the world, often through the low intelligence of those parts of the uneducated populations who are unable to judge human beings and therefore elect the lowest and most unfit elements to governments, if they are allowed to be elected at all in the countries concerned, so that only greedy for power and stupid people govern the people. This is how these lowly intelligent and simple-minded people get into governments and also keep creating new laws, rules and regulations, etc., and devising new state orders. Because these rulers and lunatics have regulated everything down to the last detail and want the citizens to live according to their confused personal personalities. But all order, freedom and independence of human beings is lost in the process. Of course, and I do not want to deny this in any way, human beings educated in humanity and knowledge of creation, etc., also find their way into governments, state offices, authorities, security services, and other responsible positions. And these human beings, who are not religious believers but truth knowers, who are also clearly aware that creation never demands humility, but requires respect, dignity, honor, and attention, are cut and despised by all those who are averse to logic, clear understanding, and reason. And so, as a rule, the righteous are not granted the opportunity to come out and work in their behavior of humanity, in their knowledge of creation, and also as the real thing that human beings effectively are. In contrast to such people, today it is constantly and increasingly the case that only the opposite have the chance to get to the helm of governments, state offices and authorities, etc., because as a rule only madmen from the people are elected to governments and authorities, etc., who seize their ambitions of might and devise and enact new laws, regulations, rules, and ordinances, whereby human beings are increasingly enslaved in their freedom and independence. This, while righteous citizens, who conscientiously cultivate humanity and are not enslaved to a faith, but who dignify and honor the truth and dedicate themselves to creation or nature and its entire universe-wide existence, are sidelined, shunned, and frowned upon by religious believers, while all worldly believers are lied to and deceived, and financially cheated and fleeced. But if we continue to look at and analyze those who have learned something higher,
Then it is no better with those who are studied and come to the helm of governments.
for these are usually even worse than those from the peoples who are elected to govern, because all these higher ones usually act primarily as powerful people, and terrorize the peoples whom they should govern rightly and accordingly also treat as human beings who have rights, freedom, and their independence. However, the greedy for power in the governments and state offices as well as authorities, etc., generally constrict the human beings of the populations, and in all things exempt, curtail and suck them dry, so to speak, through high taxes, fines and taxes, etc. On the other hand, those in power are becoming ever more powerful, and in future will rise above the entire population in this way, and also seize mighty total control over human beings, including their private lives. The personal handling of one's own finances, one's money, this is already a decided reality, which is already fully applied in certain states and also partially applied in others, will in future no longer be allowed to be done by human beings themselves, but only by the absolute control of state leaders via the banks.
And this has effectively and really already begun,
without the people in their indifference and trustfulness realizing anything about it, because the various states and banks even secretly prepared themselves for this very early on and began this evil and very bad degenerating Ausartung of oppressing human beings as early as the last century. And the whole thing today is already more evil, more cunning, and meaner than it used to be through the bailiffs. Citizens must already be happy and grateful if they can still withdraw money from their own bank account and use it independently and decide on it. And also that human beings can still be happy that they are not already being forced more and more to pay for everything they buy with credit cards, or that they are only allowed to buy things online and pay for them digitally. And that the future will bring all of this to totality is already certain and will inevitably happen because the people and their low intelligence and indifference will not stand up to the powerful governments, the financial world, the banks, the economy, etc. in any wise, and will not put a stop to all of this in order to prevent all of these insidious and ever more and more severe enslaving machinations, which will ultimately completely deprive everyone, down to the last human being, of personal freedom and self-determination. The future will bring all this, as I myself have seen with Svath, because the populations or the peoples do not rise up against injustice and simply let everything happen to them indifferently, lowly intelligent and therefore not thinking and simple-minded. Consequently, everything that is unjust and against true personal freedom and self-determination will have the most serious consequences in times to come. This is because, in future, there is a threat of absolute control for every person, namely via chips to be implanted in the body, which even determine the absolute control of libido competence, and ultimately even its destination and thus sex. In addition to losing all personal freedom and purpose, human beings will be even more overrun and overtaxed, dependent and enslaved by futuristic technology, developed 1,500 to 2,000 years too early, depending on the type of product, than is already the case today. The futuristic technology that is already flooding the whole of humanity is already slowly making the majority of humanity stupid, stunted, and even more indifferent. Ausartung, deviant, unscrupulous, and even more drawn to murder, in worse forms than all the normal murderers and mass murderers. but in the same way as the murderous criminals of the military in particular are. And the worst and most evil will come when AI or artificial intelligence has developed to such a high level that it has become self-thinking and self-constructing, because then it will turn against humanity and remove its own existence from any control of humanity, just as it will destroy a large part of it. Although it is still a short time before this madness can be stopped, the great evil of indifference, lack of conscience, low intelligence and stupidity, megalomania and delusions of wealth and know-it-all attitude, as well as the ever-increasing stupidity and depravity and the sheer idiocy of the Ausartung of those earthlings, who just look on indifferently and let everything happen, will take their revenge in the future, even if this is on the descendants and their descendants of today's indifferent and conscienceless, who prevent all logic, reason, and rationality in themselves out of low intelligence and make everything inevitable. Consequently, it will come to pass in the future that the future earthlings.
This has already occurred several times on Earth, but you should not mention it. What will happen in the future is described in this way in my grandfather's annals. As you and you have already said some things that you should not, but perhaps.
But more need not be said, and besides, I can at least dot the I's where I have mentioned.
That is probably necessary. Because, and effectively, it is the case that the majority of human beings on Earth are so blinded in their religious faith that there would be an all-knowing and all-helping eternal God if from the bottom of their souls, that is to say, fervently begged for help, and he would then help in all need, if this was necessary. It is clear to me that the majority of Earth humans will not listen to logic, understanding, and reason, as you have stated, and that the Earth humans themselves create these values within themselves. This will certainly not be the case, because their indifference and atrophy have already become entangled in the present time in a form from which they will probably no longer be able to free themselves. In truth, only a tiny and very small part of Earth humans has turned to the true as well as their own and correct way of thinking, while the majority has devoted itself to the delusion of religious belief. With the grouping emerging from this mass, which formed itself as powerful and false as well as very negative leaders of Earth humanity, will continue to form itself and carry on and deepen what you call bailiwick, and will lead earthly humanity to the irretrievable and complete lack of freedom and malicious power of determination of the authorities, as I could read from my grandfather's annals. And that in the future, which has already begun badly on Earth, will be brought about by the leaders of the states, the financial system, the banks and the economy, etc., with the help of futuristic technologies and electronics and their applications, which were brought forth much too early, can no longer be stopped due to the indifference of Earth humans. Everything is becoming a very far-reaching and even all-encompassing lack of freedom for Earth humans. Because the coming and already pending further development of electronic technology is progressing rapidly, namely through the following quantum computing. In the electronics development industry of Earth humans, this next phase of electronic development is already being called quantum computing, which will be followed very quickly by the next phase. This quantum computing will become the ultimate technology of the next expansion of the electronics generation, which is currently still in the early stages of development. But this still futuristic technology will very soon cause a furore and determine the future and the lack of freedom of Earth humans even more than is already the case. I know from my grandfather's annals that this technology is already unstoppable because it has already begun, so disaster will come one way or another. In the future, quantum computers and their subsequent further development will determine everything and ultimately take over the leadership or enslavement, what it will really be, of Earth humans. This will go far beyond what Earth humans have ever imagined. When the arrival of all previous computer beings will be far surpassed and Earth humans will be completely deprived of their freedom and independence with quantum chips implanted in their bodies and developed for this purpose in the future. Earth humans will be enslaved by the authorities, etc., to such an extent that they will no longer be able to take a single step without absolute state control. because their indifference and religious faith will make this inevitable. Overall, this will not make life easier for Earth humans and allow them to organize the processes of life more smoothly and efficiently, but all this will, in reality and truth, make the exact opposite the case.
Then every prayer of the believers in religion will fail. Because then perhaps the reality and its truth will become recognizable to the believers, namely that every god corresponds only to a delusion and therefore an imagination. Perhaps human beings will then finally realize that never a prayer and every cry for help to a god, however fervent, remains unheard, and that every human being must help himself if he needs any help, which he may still be able to give himself when he finally realizes that he himself is what he sees as the imaginary god.
This is so and not otherwise. But talking more and more about all the criminal injustices of America will not bring about any change and therefore no success in changing anything for the better. The leaders of the nations of Earth, as well as many human beings of the nations, are afraid of America's revenge, and they are also afraid if only something negative is mentioned.
I have been told that many times by people who were afraid to reveal something that had happened to them at the hands of America. But I still have some questions that have been sent to me, such as this one, asking when a human being is really dead. After all, there are cases where the dead suddenly come back to life. My answer? This is of course an absolute and utter nonsense, which I would like to explain and correct. If a human being or any other living being dies and is really dead, then life can never return to the deceased body, because the life energy of creation has effectively escaped from it. A return and a revival or continuation of life after death is therefore not possible. However, when a human being or other living being dies, the creation life energy does not escape from the body in a flash, but continues to linger in it for some time, depending on what the cause of death is. If this proceeds normally, then the creation life energy continues to be stored for minutes, hours, or even days, depending on the cause of death. And if the creation life energy then really escapes from the body and effectively leaves it, after this process of escaping the body still triggers rigor mortis and possibly corpse marks. This is then proof that the body is really dead and that death has occurred, which means that a return to life is also no longer possible.
Next question. How is it possible to predestine something for the next life?
My answer: to predetermine something for the next life is illusory and absolutely impossible, because this religious claim is absolute nonsense, because there is no predestination or predetermination for the next life. This is because when human beings die, the life energy of creation escapes from their consciousness and immediately merges into the level of creation energy. Here it processes the knowledge gathered in material life and integrates it so that after a certain time, which is undefined, a new consciousness of a new personality is born as creation of life energy, which no longer has any relevance to the previous personality except for the overall knowledge learned, which corresponds to the evolution of the creation life energy. Thus, a completely new personality is born that no longer has any relevance to the previously lived personality, as a result of which no memories of a previous life also appear. However, if cases occur that are supposedly based on past memories, then these are formed in such a way that they are stored as memories in the memory banks, swinging waves of the earth, and can be perceived depending on the level of consciousness of a human being and their ability. As a rule, the stored memory vibrations are of a completely foreign nature, meaning that they are not identical to the swinging waves of the previous personality, but are really deposited by another personality and like so-called ghosts, but are erroneously defined by the new personality as their own.
Next question. What is creation if not a god, saint, or other divine being?
My answer: creation is what we human beings on Earth simply call nature, whereby we refer to it in other words as all-encompassing energy and power, which exists and lives universally and animates everything from the simplest matter, and so from the tiniest grain of dust to every stone, rock, and the largest mountain. This also applies to the tiniest life form. The smallest life form known to date, the riding dwarf, or the so-called Nanoarchaeum equitans, a prehistoric bacterium that sits on another bacterium and, if you like, rides on it. The whole universe is therefore nature or creation, which has 7 level belts, each separated into 7 different dimensions and types of energy, as well as 7 different universes in 7 dimensions, whereby in each universe, the 4th level belt forms a material cosmos, in which there are countless Milky Ways, suns, planets, moons, and asteroids, as well as all dust and countless types of energies and their forces.
Now I have Manuel B. here, and he recently emailed me the following excerpt from Wikipedia. Apparently, in response to Semmelweis's letter of thanks, Louis Kugelmann from Hanover wrote on 10 August 1861, Note Manual, which also applies to Billy and the religion's sects.
Only very few have been granted the honor of rendering real, great, and lasting services to humanity, and with few exceptions, the world has crucified and burned its benefactors. I therefore hope that you will not tire in the honorable struggle that remains to you. You can miss an early victory all the less, as many of your original opponents have de facto already professed your teaching. How surprising it is that people who for years have written and spoken, perhaps incomprehensibly to themselves, about things that are not understood, also immediately endeavor to cover up this gap in their knowledge. Not many put the love of truth above self-love. Some are probably caught up in habitual self-deception. For others, the crude sarcasm of Heinrich Heine, who says somewhere, when Pythagoras had discovered his famous theorem, he sacrificed a hecatomb. Manuel's note, cattle/ox sacrifice. Since then, the cattle, oxen, have had an instinctive fear of discovering truths. Excerpt from Wikipedia. Homer already called a sacrifice of 12 bulls, lambs, sheep, and goats, Pindar even of donkeys, a hecatomb. Homer, ancient Greek Smiros, pronounced Homer in German, is traditionally regarded as the author of the Iliad and the Odyssey, and therefore the earliest poet of the West. Pindar, ancient Greek Pindarus Pindaros, Latinized Pindarus, 522 or 518 BC in Knoskephali near Thebes, plus after 446 BC, was a Greek poet and belongs to the canon of the 9 lyric poets.
So that is just the information I want to pass on to you. Now apparently the rulers of China are also mad, because now the president of China, Xi Jinping, is also calling for Chinese women to give birth to more offspring. Crazy? As apparently rich Switzerland also is, only in a different area, namely environmental protection, for which it does too little in terms of global climate protection, which is why the rich country is already listed on the internet in this regard. Switzerland is listed as follows. Switzerland has fallen 12 places to 33rd in the Climate Change Performance Index CCPI of non-governmental organizations in the space of a year. According to the environmental protection organizations WWF and Greenpeace, the main reason for the fall is the standstill in climate policy until 2030. Switzerland is now in 33rd place in the ranking. I think this is more than just shabby for Switzerland. But what else can be expected from a government of a country that tolerates and protects traitors in its own ranks on the one hand, and on the other hand allows them to continue to muddle through in office? Also when, as in the case of Switzerland, neutrality is called into question and traditional national friendships are made to look bad and destroyed as a result. If, on the other hand, a person from the population were to act in a way that was both treasonous and destructive of neutrality, then the entire government of the country would run amok and punish the guilty party or parties in a court of law.
Equal and equal is unfortunately not the same thing. As you have said several times in our conversations, this in the wise that there is a double standard on earth when it comes to judging criminal offenses of persons. The double standard, as you call it, is applied when it comes to ordinary persons from the population or state leaders, and also when economic persons or persons from the so-called upper classes or the wealthy commit criminal offenses. This is common in all states worldwide, as we play are and have known for a long time. But if we look at the whole thing, it is so common in all states on earth that nothing can be done about it. And moreover, the peoples on earth tacitly and indifferently accept the whole of this injustice.
Exactly. That is what it is. The silence and indifference, which will lead to that which in the future will take hold of all earthlings and incapacitate every single human being, young or old, and place them under absolute state control. Consequently, their freedom is then only a thing of the past. But the earthling in his indifference does not care about this, because in his erroneous belief, whether religious or secular, he is paralyzed for reality and its truth, and can only pretend. Therefore, he also does not care that the UV radiation is now 10% stronger.
How right you are, but that does not produce any success with Earth humans in terms of them listening to your words and changing for the better. But now, Edward, my friend, I have my duties to attend to again, so I tell you that Arlian will be coming to you next, for there is much to do. So I bid you farewell.
Okay, also goodbye, and I will wait for Arlian.